Sunday, June 22nd, 1941, 7 o'clock in the morning. Winston Churchill slept in his bedroom at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, while Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Downstairs, John Colville, Churchill's private secretary, held a telephone receiver in his hand. The voice on the line belonged to the Foreign Office duty officer. 3 million German soldiers had crossed the Soviet border at 4 o'clock that morning. The largest invasion in human history had begun 2 hours ago. The Prime Minister didn't know yet. Colville climbed the stairs to Churchill's bedroom and knocked. Soft at first, careful not to startle, then harder. Churchill had been up late the night before, working until 3 in the morning as he always did. The Prime Minister needed his sleep. But this couldn't wait. What Churchill said when he learned of the invasion and what he would broadcast to Britain that evening would reveal everything about how he understood war, about what he was willing to sacrifice to survive, and about the moral calculations leaders make when facing absolute evil. Britain in June 1941 stood in a place no nation wants to be, alone. France had fallen a year earlier. The British had been driven from the European continent at Dunkirk. For 10 months, German bombers had pounded London and other cities night after night. More than 40,000 British civilians were dead. The Blitz had left entire neighborhoods in rubble, families sleeping in underground stations, children evacuated to the countryside. At sea, German U-boats hunted British merchant ships in wolf packs. In April and May of 1941, Britain lost over 1 million tons of shipping. Food was rationed, fuel was rationed, everything was rationed. The Atlantic Lifeline, the convoys bringing food and weapons from America, was being slowly strangled. Military defeats mounted. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps drove British forces back across Libya. In the Mediterranean, German aircraft dominated the skies. In the Balkans, Yugoslavia fell in 11 days, Greece in 3 weeks. Everywhere Churchill looked, his forces were retreating, falling back, barely holding on. The American Lend-Lease Act had passed in March, promising weapons and supplies, but America wasn't in the war. Roosevelt sympathized. Roosevelt helped, but American soldiers weren't fighting. American pilots weren't flying. American ships weren't sailing into combat. Britain fought with the Commonwealth. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, but against the combined might of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, it wasn't enough. And now Hitler had turned east. Against the one nation Churchill had spent 25 years opposing. Against the communist regime he despised. Against Stalin. The door opened. Churchill, in his dressing gown, looked at Colville with tired eyes. Colville delivered the news. Hitler had invaded Russia at dawn. Churchill's face changed. Not to shock, not to confusion, to something Colville would later describe as satisfaction. A smile played at the corners of Churchill's mouth. Then he nodded, turned away, and said nothing more. He would spend the rest of that Sunday preparing the most important speech of his political life, because Churchill understood something in that moment that changed the war. Hitler had just made his greatest mistake, and Britain, exhausted, bombed, besieged Britain, had just received the one thing it desperately needed: time. But to exploit that time, Churchill would have to do something nearly impossible. He would have to convince the British people to embrace an ally they had been taught to hate. He would have to stand before the nation and declare support for Stalin, Joseph Stalin, whose regime had murdered millions, whose secret police terrorized his own people, whose non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939 had enabled the Nazi conquest of Poland. Churchill had warned Stalin this was coming. British intelligence had detected the massive German buildup along the Soviet border for weeks. Churchill had sent multiple warnings through diplomatic channels, specific warnings with dates and details. Stalin ignored them all. The Soviet dictator, paranoid about British intentions, convinced himself it was a trick, an attempt to provoke war between Germany and the Soviet Union. So when 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft smashed across the border that Sunday morning, Stalin was unprepared, disbelieving. His air force sat on runways and was destroyed. His border units were overrun. His generals frantically called Moscow, and for hours, Moscow didn't respond. Stalin had retreated to his dacha, unable to process what was happening, temporarily paralyzed by the reality that Hitler had betrayed him. The news reached London through multiple channels: Foreign Office cables, intelligence reports, BBC monitors picking up German radio broadcasts announcing the invasion. By mid-morning, it was confirmed beyond doubt. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's war on Bolshevism, his campaign for Lebensraum, his crusade against what he called Jewish Bolshevik subhumanity, had begun. Churchill dressed. He walked the grounds of Chequers with his wife Clementine and with Colville. The summer morning was quiet. English countryside, green and peaceful. Hard to imagine that across the continent, the largest military operation in history was underway. Harder still to imagine what Churchill was about to do. Because Churchill hated communism, not as a political abstraction, not as an intellectual exercise, with genuine, visceral hatred built over 25 years. In 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized power, Churchill had called them a plague, a cancer, a mortal threat to civilization itself. As Secretary of War in 1919, he had advocated for military intervention to crush the Bolshevik government, calling it a duty to strangle the regime at birth. He sent British troops and weapons to support the White Russian forces in the Civil War. When the Whites lost and the Soviet state survived, Churchill watched in horror as Lenin and then Stalin built a totalitarian system that murdered its own citizens by the millions. Churchill had documented the Soviet famines, the purges, the show trials, the secret police. He had condemned the closing of churches, the suppression of free speech, the denial of basic liberties. He had watched Stalin sign the Non-Aggression Pact with Hitler in August 1939, the pact that divided Poland between two tyrants, the pact that gave Hitler a free hand to attack westward while secure in the east. For 25 years, Churchill's anti-communism had been consistent, public, and fierce. And now, on a quiet Sunday morning in June, Churchill had to throw it all away. Not the beliefs, those remained, but the priority. Because Hitler was worse, because Hitler was immediate, because Hitler was at Britain's throat, and Stalin, whatever his crimes, whatever his tyranny, was now Hitler's enemy. Walking the lawn at Chequers, Churchill spoke the calculation aloud, testing the words. Colville listened. Churchill said it simply. If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. It wasn't a joke. It was the coldest, most pragmatic strategic assessment a leader could make. Britain was losing. Britain might not survive. And if allying with Stalin, temporarily, expedient, necessary, gave Britain a chance, then Churchill would do it without hesitation. By afternoon, Churchill had made his decision. He would broadcast to the nation that evening. He would speak without consulting the War Cabinet first, without securing approval, without hedging. This was his call, his responsibility. He would take it. Churchill's staff prepared the BBC for a prime ministerial address at 9 o'clock that night. Word spread. In homes across Britain, families gathered around wireless sets. They knew something enormous had happened. German troops in Russia. But what would Churchill say? What would it mean? Because the British people had their own complicated relationship with the Soviet Union. Communist parties in Britain had opposed the war effort during the period of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, calling it an imperialist war, urging workers not to support British militarism. Soviet foreign policy had been hostile, opportunistic, cynical, and yet And yet ordinary Britons also remembered that the Soviet Union represented something different from Nazi Germany. Flawed, brutal, repressive, yes, but not genocidal in quite the same way, not driven by the same race hatred, not threatening to enslave and murder everyone it conquered. Still, this alliance would be difficult to sell. It would require Churchill to acknowledge his past opposition while explaining the present necessity. It would require him to separate the Russian people from their government, to distinguish patriotic defense of homeland from endorsement of communist ideology. It would require the careful navigation of moral complexity in a moment when simplicity would have been easier. Churchill spent the afternoon writing. He worked in his study, dictating to stenographers, revising, refining. The speech needed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously: condemn Hitler, acknowledge Soviet flaws, promise aid, explain strategic necessity, maintain moral clarity, inspire hope, all in one broadcast. What emerged was one of the masterpieces of wartime rhetoric. At 9 o'clock Sunday evening, June 22nd, 1941, Winston Churchill sat before a BBC microphone and began to speak. He opened with history. He reminded listeners that at 4 o'clock that morning, Hitler had invaded Russia. He described it as another Nazi act of perfidy, another violation of treaty, another example of Hitler's pattern of deceit. He placed Barbarossa in the sequence of invasions: Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, all attacked after assurances of peace. Now Russia. Then Churchill said something remarkable. He said none of this surprised him. He had warned Stalin. He had given clear and precise warnings of what was coming. Whether those warnings had been heeded, Churchill didn't know, but he had tried. Next came the pivot, the moment Churchill had to execute with perfect precision. No one has been a more consistent opponent of communism than I have for the last 25 years, Churchill declared. I will unsay no word that I have spoken about it. Pause. Let that land. Establish credibility. Remind people he wasn't naive, wasn't changing his beliefs, wasn't pretending the Soviet Union was anything other than what it was. Then, but all this fades away before the spectacle which is now unfolding. All this, 25 years of opposition, every speech, every article, every denunciation, fades away, not erased, not forgotten, but rendered less important by the immediate threat. The past, with its crimes, its follies, and its tragedies, flashes away like lightning. Quick, sharp, illuminating for a moment, and then gone. The rhetorical move was brilliant. Churchill wasn't asking people to forget Soviet crimes. He was asking them to set those crimes aside, temporarily, strategically, because something more urgent demanded attention. Churchill described the invasion. He painted the picture in visceral detail. German armies drawing up along a line stretching from the White Sea to the Black Sea. Air fleets and armored divisions moving slowly, methodically, preparing for the assault. Then the attack. The mechanized columns crashing forward, the German war machine rolling over Soviet defenses. I see the Russian soldiers standing on the threshold of their native land, Churchill said. I see them guarding their homes where mothers and wives pray. I see the 10,000 villages of Russia where the means of existence is wrung so hardly from the soil, but where there are still primordial human joys, where maidens laugh and children play. This was Churchill's genius. He separated regime from people. He spoke not of communists or Bolsheviks, but of Russian mothers, Russian children, Russian villages. He made the invasion not about ideology, but about homes and families. He humanized the victims without endorsing their government. I see advancing upon all this in hideous onslaught the Nazi war machine, with its clanking, heel-clicking, dandified Prussian officers, its crafty expert agents fresh from the cowing and tying down of a dozen countries. I see also the dull, drilled, docile, brutish masses of the Hun soldiery plodding on like a swarm of crawling locusts. The language was harsh, deliberately harsh. Churchill needed his audience to understand that this was about defeating Nazism, not embracing communism. The enemy was clear. The enemy was Hitler. Whatever the complications of Soviet tyranny, Nazi Germany represented something worse, something that had to be stopped. Churchill explained Hitler's strategy. He told Britons why Hitler had invaded Russia, not merely ideology, not merely Lebensraum. Strategy. Hitler wanted to destroy Russian power so he could turn all his forces back westward, back against Britain. The invasion of Russia was a prelude to the attempted invasion of the British Isles. If Hitler imagines that his attack on Soviet Russia will cause the slightest division of aims or slackening of effort in the great democracies who are resolved upon his doom, Churchill said, he is woefully mistaken. Then came the commitment. The line that changed everything. Any man or state who fights on against Nazism will have our aid. Any man or state who marches with Hitler is our foe. Simple, direct, unambiguous. Britain would help anyone fighting Hitler. It didn't matter who they were, what they believed, what crimes they had committed. If they fought Hitler, Britain would aid them. It follows, therefore, that we shall give whatever help we can to Russia and the Russian people. Whatever help we can. Not unlimited, not uncritical, but substantial. Real. Committed. The Russian danger is therefore our danger, and the danger of the United States, just as the cause of any Russian fighting for his hearth and home is the cause of free men and free peoples in every quarter of the globe. Churchill linked Britain, Russia, and America together. He expanded the conflict from a European war to a global struggle. He framed Soviet resistance not as communist ideology, but as human beings defending homes. And he reminded Americans, still neutral, still watching, that this fight concerned them too. The speech concluded with Churchill's ultimate goal. We have but one aim and one single, irrevocable purpose. We are resolved to destroy Hitler and every vestige of the Nazi regime. From this nothing will turn us. Nothing. Nothing. Not sympathy for communism, not antipathy toward communism, not complicated feelings about Stalin. Nothing would distract from the singular focus, destroying Hitler. We will never parley. We will never negotiate with Hitler or any of his gang. We shall fight him by land. We shall fight him by sea. We shall fight him in the air until, with God's help, we have rid the earth of his shadow and liberated its people from his yoke. The broadcast ended. Churchill returned from the BBC to Chequers. He didn't know how it had been received, didn't know if the British people would accept this sudden alliance with their former enemy's former ally, didn't know if Stalin would appreciate the gesture or survive long enough for it to matter, because Britain's military chiefs gave the Soviet Union 6 weeks, maybe 3 months, certainly not longer. The German army had crushed Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, Yugoslavia in days. Why would Russia be different? Stalin had purged his officer corps. Soviet defenses were in disarray. German panzers were already driving deep into Soviet territory. If Russia collapsed quickly, and everyone expected it would, then Churchill's speech would be forgotten, and Hitler would turn back west with all his forces intact, his eastern flank secured, his Lebensraum won. But Churchill made a different calculation. Standing at Chequers, smoking his cigar, Churchill told his advisers he would bet that Russia would still be fighting 2 years from now. Not because Stalin was competent, not because Soviet communism was strong, because Russia was vast, because Russian winters were brutal, because the German army, for all its sophistication, would find that conquering 1,000 miles of hostile territory was different from conquering Belgium. And Churchill was betting Britain's future on being right. The British reaction to the speech was complex. Some embraced it immediately. Britain needed any ally it could get. If Stalin would fight Hitler, then Britain should help Stalin fight Hitler. Simple as that. Others struggled with the moral implications. Supporting Stalin? After the purges, after the gulags, after the pact with Hitler that started the war. But most Britons understood the logic. They had lived through a year of bombing. They had watched their cities burn. They had buried their children. They knew what it meant to fight for survival. And if Hitler was now fighting a two-front war, if German bombers and troops were being diverted east, then Britain gained breathing room. Britain gained time to rebuild. Britain gained a chance. Within 3 weeks, Churchill and Stalin had signed the Anglo-Soviet agreement. Just 96 words, the shortest diplomatic document in modern history. Britain and the Soviet Union pledged to help each other against Germany. They promised not to make a separate peace. It was the beginning of the strangest alliance of the war. Britain and the Soviet Union had nothing in common except an enemy. Churchill despised Stalin. Stalin didn't trust Churchill. Their systems were incompatible. Their values were opposed. Their post-war goals were contradictory. But for now, in the summer of 1941, they needed each other. Britain began sending aid to Russia immediately. Convoy PQ-1 left Iceland for Archangel on September 28, 1941, carrying aircraft, tanks, and supplies. It would be the first of 78 Arctic convoys that would brave German U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft to deliver 4 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union over the next 4 years. Churchill had made the calculation that Britain's survival depended on keeping Russia in the war. Every German soldier fighting in Russia was a German soldier not invading Britain. Every German tank destroyed on the Eastern Front was a German tank not rolling through Kent. Every Luftwaffe aircraft shot down over Moscow was a Luftwaffe aircraft not bombing London. It was cold pragmatism. It was necessary expedience. It was survival. And Churchill's speech on June 22, 1941, had made it possible. In one broadcast, he had shifted the entire strategic landscape. He had reframed the war not as democracy versus communism, but as civilization versus Hitler. He had given Stalin a lifeline and Britain a reprieve. He had set in motion the alliance that would ultimately destroy Nazi Germany. But the cost of that alliance would haunt the post-war world. Because Stalin didn't fight for democracy or freedom or human rights. Stalin fought for Soviet survival and Soviet expansion. And when the war ended, the Red Army would occupy Eastern Europe, and Stalin would refuse to leave. Churchill knew this would happen. Even in June 1941, even as he pledged support to Russia, Churchill understood that Stalin was not a friend, not a Democrat, not someone who shared Western values. But the alternative, Hitler conquering all of Europe, Hitler invading Britain, Hitler winning the war, was worse. Much worse. So Churchill made the deal with the devil. He said it explicitly, with characteristic bluntness. He would make a favorable reference to the devil if the devil fought Hitler. It was the hardest kind of leadership decision, the kind where there are no good options, only less catastrophic ones. The kind where you ally with tyrants to defeat worse tyrants. The kind where you compromise principles not because principles don't matter, but because losing means principles die entirely. Asked years later about his decision to support Stalin, Churchill was unapologetic. He had done what was necessary to save Britain and defeat Hitler. The alliance with Stalin had been essential. Unpleasant, complicated, morally ambiguous. Yes, but essential. "I have only one purpose," Churchill said, "the destruction of Hitler, and my life is much simplified thereby. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." In the summer of 1941, faced with possible extinction, Churchill chose survival. He chose to fight alongside a tyrant to defeat a greater tyrant. He chose strategic necessity over ideological purity. He chose to live to fight another day. The Eastern Front would become the bloodiest theater of World War II. 27 million Soviet citizens would die, soldiers and civilians, combatants and children in battles and famines and massacres and camps. The scale of death was almost incomprehensible. But the Eastern Front also destroyed the German Wehrmacht. 3/4 of all German military casualties occurred fighting the Soviet Union. Hitler's armies never recovered from Stalingrad, from Kursk, from the long retreat westward. Churchill's speech on June 22nd hadn't caused that, but it had created the conditions for the alliance that made it possible. Britain's convoys kept Russian armies supplied. British intelligence helped Russian planning. British bombers diverted German resources. It was imperfect cooperation between reluctant partners, but it was cooperation nonetheless. And it worked. In November 1941, 5 months after Churchill's broadcast, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. They could see the Kremlin towers through their binoculars. Hitler ordered one final push to take the Soviet capital before winter, but the Red Army held. Barely. With casualties mounting, with ammunition running low, with winter temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero, the Red Army held. And then, on December 5, 1941, Soviet forces counterattacked. For the first time in the war, the German army retreated. 2 days later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. The coalition Churchill had worked toward for 2 years, Britain, Russia, and America together, finally existed. Churchill had been right. Russia hadn't collapsed in 6 weeks. Russia was still fighting, and now, with America in the war, Hitler faced enemies on 3 fronts with resources he couldn't match. The outcome was no longer certain, but it was no longer impossible either. In his private papers, Churchill wrote that the period between the fall of France and the German invasion of Russia had been the most anxious of his life. Britain had stood alone with no clear path to victory. Hitler dominated Europe. Invasion seemed inevitable. Defeat seemed likely. Then Hitler turned east. Then Churchill made his choice. Then the war changed. Asked in 1959, 18 years after the broadcast, what he remembered most clearly about that Sunday in June 1941, Churchill thought carefully before answering. "The relief," he said. Not joy. There was no joy in any of it, but relief. For a year we had faced them alone, and now, whatever came next, however it ended, we weren't alone anymore. He paused, looking out the window of Chartwell, his country home at the English countryside he had fought to save. Someone else was fighting Hitler, he continued. Someone else was bleeding and dying and refusing to surrender. That changed everything. Another pause. Then he added, almost to himself, "I never liked Stalin, never trusted him, never thought he was anything but a ruthless dictator. But he kept fighting. His people kept fighting. They took losses that would have broken any other nation. They died in numbers we couldn't imagine. And they kept fighting." Churchill tamped out his cigar. "I suppose that's what I said that night. Not that Stalin was good. He wasn't. Not that communism was acceptable. It wasn't. But that we would help anyone who fought Hitler. Because in the end, that was all that mattered. Stopping Hitler, whatever it took, whoever we had to work with." He looked back from the window, and it worked. At terrible cost, with complicated consequences, with a post-war world that wasn't what we hoped. But it worked. We survived. We won. Hitler lost. Churchill died in January 1965, 20 years after the war ended, 4 years after the Berlin Wall went up, 46 years after he first warned about Bolshevism. He had lived long enough to see the Cold War entrench itself, long enough to see Eastern Europe trapped behind Stalin's Iron Curtain, long enough to wonder if the alliance he had forged in 1941 had traded one form of tyranny for another. But he had also lived long enough to see Britain survive, to see democracy endure in Western Europe, to see America and Britain stand together against Soviet expansion, to see that the choice he made on June 22nd, 1941, the choice to support Stalin against Hitler, had prevented something worse. Not because it was a good choice. There were no good choices in June 1941. Only necessary ones. Churchill made his choice. He spoke those words into the BBC microphone. He committed Britain to an alliance that would win the war and define the peace. And in doing so, he revealed the truth about leadership in moments of existential crisis. Sometimes you don't get to choose your allies. Sometimes you don't get to choose your path. Sometimes you only get to choose whether to survive or to surrender. Churchill chose survival, whatever it took.